Welcome to the Recruitment Hackers Podcast, a show about innovations, technology, and leaders in the recruitment industry. Brought to you by TalkPush, the leading recruitment automation platform.
Hello, welcome back to the Recruitment Hackers Podcast. I'm your host, Max Armbruster, and today on the show, joining us from, I believe, Philadelphia, Ward Christman. Hi, Ward.
Hello, great to be on, and thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, are you in Philadelphia? Did I get that right?
That's the general area. We're about almost an hour west out in the country somewhat, but yeah.
Okay. In the pine trees somewhere?
Actually, not that many pine trees around here, mostly the big leafy kind that people love raking up in the fall. And
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I met Ward a few years ago in Boston in an event organized by HR Tech Tank, where you were a strategic advisor. But today, Ward is the co-founder and chief advisor for the HR Tech Alliances, which you can go on hrtechalliances.com, and works as an advisor to HR tech vendors around the world. And so I hope we'll take this opportunity to share some of your insights on the challenges felt by the buyers, which are the TA directors and the TA departments all over the world, when dealing with vendors, and the fact that this HR stack keeps growing and growing and growing, and it becomes more work to manage the integration than it is to manage the vendors actually, I imagine, at a pretty fast rate for some of them. So that's the direction in which this conversation will go. But before we go there, Ward, for our audience, I'm sure they'd love to hear a little bit about your background and how you ended up being this matchmaker for the HR tech world, which is quite a niche role. But I believe a long time ago you were an engineer and then an entrepreneur of an HR tech entrepreneur as well.
That's right. Yeah. Engineering was great, building plutonium factories and all kinds of weird stuff. But actually, it wasn't for me. But somebody introduced me to the internet back in like 1989, 1990, in that range. And it was just text-based then. But I thought this might go somewhere. So I actually left engineering and started one of the first job boards before the web was even commercialized. So that's how old I am. But yeah, it's coming up on 30 years. And yeah, I ran a job board for, gosh, how many years was that? 9 years? And then the dot-com crash, 9/11.
I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile. Yeah. It says from 92 to 2001, you ran jobnet.com. And so, yeah, that's 9 years.
Yeah, it was a great run and got a couple, master type level, I think, degrees out of it, how to raise money, what not to do, especially when a dot-com crash or 9/11 type activities hit us between the eyes.
Perfect timing.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just like, the COVID pandemic and all that stuff. It's like, I kind of feel like I've been through this ringer a few times. So we actually grew last year, and, it wasn't by accident, because there's just, different ways to take on things. But from a talent acquisition leader standpoint, obviously, those of you that are lucky to have your job and are able to keep your technology if your budgets didn't get slashed, that's wonderful. And if you didn't, what are you doing now to maybe rebuild it? Or is it with the coming recovery, let's put it that way, are you going to rebuild your tech stack? And, what are good approaches? What are bad approaches? We've seen it all over the years, and it's great to have a chance to kind of have an open dialogue about how to.
Nothing is completely new. Every mistake has already been made. And so you were reminiscing, without giving us specifics, on some of the mistakes you did at jobnet.com, a few decades ago, coming into what was at the time Armageddon, the end of the world, the dot-com bust, which was just when I was graduating from school, by the way. So I entered a market with high unemployment, no prospect, and everybody in my MBA was talking about the paradigm shift and the internet economy. And then as soon as I graduated, I mean, I was talking like one of those startup guys, but there was no startup jobs to be had anymore.
Yeah.
So, big
Well,
disconnect.
but they're out there now for sure. And as you can imagine, in recruiting tech, I mean, how many of those are started by a staffing leader, if not internal, certainly a recruiting company or staffing company, right? Where like, oh, we can do it better than Bullhorn or whoever, and then they build it. And guess what? The tools are so much easier every year. There's more and more tools that you can build your own thing. And some companies, as we know, build their own ATS and stuff like that. And we have 457 ATSs that we track in our database,
Wow.
and I'm sure we're probably missing half of them on a global basis. So why would a company build an ATS? It'd probably be cheaper to go buy one, especially right now, right? If you wanted to own it.
It'd be cheaper to buy an ATS company, you mean? The
Yeah,
whole company, right?
exactly, right? It's so true. But, I remember a few years back, Facebook recruiter called me and said, hey, we're, building our own ATS, your background in product, and I'd helped run the product for Connexa before IBM took over. Do you want to be considered for this job? I'm like, you're building your own? Is this to take out to market? I mean, if it's take out to market, I'm interested to talk about it. But if you're just going to build it and run it in-house, no. Why would you do that? And of course, Facebook has a few engineers. I get it.
Yeah, they could build anything they want, but
and apparently the TA leaders are like, well, why should we settle for whatever? We can build our own, and they did it. I don't know if they're still doing it actually, but
Google built their own ATS, and Microsoft will probably end up buying an ATS. That was the rumor that was being circulated by Chad and Cheese on their podcast.
And these things, they continue to happen. And I mean, I remember 6 years ago, I was on the blog squad for what was HR Tech World, now Unleash, in Amsterdam. And they're like, oh, hey, we want you to interview some of the folks here at the conference that are, the speakers and influencers, stuff like that. I'm like, okay, great. And they're like, yeah, we want you to interview Jason Averbook and Josh Burson. And I'm like, thanks a lot. My first time to this event, you give me the two biggest names in the industry to interview on camera, and it went great. But I remember talking to Josh Burson. I'm like, hey, let's talk about consolidation for a minute, right? You got these big fish eating all the small fish. The way I see it, it just, it's going to keep happening, but I see a future where there's more of the point solutions kind of being assembled in a way that people can use that. They don't have to necessarily buy that pre-canned, giant offering that has everything in it, right? And he totally agreed. He said, and he thinks it's going to get much, not worse, but more choices, more complicated.
More fragmented.
Some of your listeners are like, it's exactly right. It's like, well, all I need is a chatbot, and our current provider is not on the roadmap for another year or two. We need it now. So where do we go look? And all of a sudden there's all these choices, and there's new ones popping up all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's just one tiny sliver of whole TA tech stack, right? I was helping Rollpoint come to market. They needed referenceable clients, so I helped them get their sales strategy set up and get some of those referenceable clients. I remember one of them, I think it was Brad. He was with Informatica, and I'm like, so I see you really like what this has to offer. How's that going to fit into your stack? And I was expecting, we've got 5 or 6 pieces, right? And he said, yeah, we've got 32 TA tech solutions today in-house, and this will be 33, and we'll find I'm like, are you kidding me? And they were maybe 1,000 people or something. How do you have 32? It's unbelievable how many solutions are out there, and that's not even count.
But that's a testament to how easy it's become to buy and to start using. I mean, that would be impossible 20 years ago when everything was on premise to have 20, even
right.
10 solutions.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely.
And most of those contracts are not a hard logs, right? So if they were not useful, these 30 solutions would probably lose the contract within the next year.
Well, that's one thing. And he liked to play with new tech, very much
Okay.
a shiny object kind of guy, which is great. And he commanded the budget to play, and that's wonderful. I mean, so many early stage companies would love to have that. But if you're on the consumer side, you're the head of talent acquisition, and you're trying to figure out, our stack's a little wobbly. Why is that? What his issue was, and most is, how do you get them to talk to each other so you're not doing double entry or triple entry,
Yes.
or the data is flowing at the right time, or if it's flowing at all. What we found, and one of the reasons we exist advising the vendor executives, is a lot of them don't even know they're supporting the same client, let alone working together. So our mission in life is to help them discover that, who else is there supporting that client, and get them to
Yeah.
play nice in the sandbox, because there's always overlap, right? And if there is overlap, how do you keep them from trying to point fingers at each other? And then anybody listening to this knows, like, oh yeah, you call one vendor and complain, hey, the data is missing, where'd it go, or it didn't get there. Well, they're going to say, well, it's somebody else's fault, right? and then you ask them, and they're like, well, it was their fault. And it's like, well, that doesn't help. So
Yeah. Those meetings are happening all the time. And what's the overall trends that you're seeing? The sort of, 5-year, 10-year trend? Is it that the vendors are becoming more open or more closed? Are they trying, because in 2020, there was consolidation. People wanted to become more essential for their customer, because as budgets were being slashed, they tried to hold on to as much business as possible. So in that environment, I guess it does not favor a very collaborative mindset, because if the pie is shrinking, then everybody wants a bigger slice of it.
yeah,
Maybe that's a bump on the road of generally a more collaborative mindset and trend, or is that wishful thinking?
well, yeah, I mean, you're right. There's some people panic in the wrong place. And I think, what last year taught many of us anyway is you need a strong partner network. And if you're a consumer or buyer of these systems, if your vendors aren't playing nice together in the sandbox, it's only going to get worse when stress levels go up. Or if you do have to cut, how do you know what to cut, if anything? What's going to, if it's like, Jenga or something, and you pull out the wrong piece, the whole thing could come collapsing, right? And so it's not easy, but the reality is, yeah, there's definitely some consolidation driven by the buyers. And yeah, I don't see that changing necessarily, but what I also do see on the flip side is, with more options for better point solutions, more mature point solutions, ones that can evolve more quickly. I mean, that's the main reason the big fish are eating the small fish, because the big ones can't innovate. They're like the Titanic. They're great at cruising across the ocean, but they can't maneuver like a smaller boat. And that's where the point solutions can really showcase innovation, adapt to the environment more quickly. And the only way the big ones are going to get that typically is through acquisition, so consolidation. And that just leaves a vacuum, frankly, for new innovation to bubble up and take shape.
Yeah. And it seems to me as a technologist that when I hear about this consolidation that happens, and there's some, mega mergers from a couple of years ago, K1 and JobVite, that, and I think you were saying you were involved with RollPoint, so you'd be familiar with this one. That's the size and ambition of this is a sales-driven consolidation. Like I don't think any engineer came up with the idea of, oh, let's bring all of these things together and it'll be a beautiful product at the end. The engineers are probably, just still wondering what the hell happened to them,
Right. Well, and actually, we've been talking to a number of different investment groups lately, and we're seeing the same thing there, where they're looking at the solution stack and saying, how do we stack together solutions that can be an offering in the marketplace, right? And that's certainly what the JobVite rollup meant, at least to me, is how do you fill the gaps without building? And they've got to decide, do they build, buy, or partner? And in that case, there's some buying going on. Their partner strategy has always been kind of a roller coaster ride from what we've seen. lot of opportunity. I mean, now that Allison's there now, I think there's an opportunity for them to really, revamp their partner network and make a difference for their customers instead of trying to build everything and it tends to take longer than finding a partner. And your question earlier about openness, I guess, versus closed, definitely seeing a trend more towards the open APIs and different ways for the vendors to collaborate and share the data, and sometimes invisibly to the customer, which is maybe a perfect scenario, right? Where, hey, if I hire somebody, I just want that data to, just flow through our various systems. I don't need to know exactly how it happens or what happens, just that it's going to happen reliably and save us time and effort and getting people onboarded and, into the company.
And have you seen some of the employers, the talent acquisition folks, start to build in-house system integration teams to serve as the glue between all of these systems? Does a TA director in 2021 need to have an engineering team?
They could, and if the vendors don't get their stuff together, then that might be the only way to fix it. Especially the bigger companies, because they've got long-term contracts. They can't just, rip and replace things so easily, right? Even with open APIs and all that, there's a lot of investment, which is why some legacy systems, not to be named, are still chugging along. You look at the benefits space, my goodness, they're still sending data back and forth through flat file CSV files. And, so recruiting's kind of often the leader of the pack when it comes to using and leveraging the newer technology and open APIs and stuff like that. But
it's a little bit more playful, and perhaps because you're dealing with candidates instead of staff, so you have a little bit more freedom, but also perhaps because you're dealing with the market, which is every talent pool, every geography has its own dynamic, and for the buyer, an opportunity to play and say, well, yeah, I respect our global tech stack, but here in ... we do things differently. And I have to go, because they have the budget to spend on advertising. And if you can buy an ad in a local newspaper, then you can also buy a software service. I mean, it's the same budget. So that's something that we've been leveraging at TalkPush.
Yeah, no, it is charred. And now more so than anything with, work from home policies, right? We're quickly becoming more global organizations across the board, and not all HR tech are built to work in all these different local geographies and so forth. Local laws, all the stuff that varies from state to state sometimes, let alone country to country. So what's interesting too, when I used to do more consulting directly with the employers, if they were on a global footprint, my recommendation, if you need a system that's global, you might want to start looking like solutions built in Europe or something that are kind of more multi-country enabled out of the box, just because that's how Europe operates. Whereas in the US, it's like, oh yeah, we've got 100 clients and it's English only, it's only domestic, and going to other countries, it becomes a much bigger task than, let's say, a European company, I think, often coming here to the States to support that. So
there's actually a lot of European software company in our space which ended up going to the US, right? I mean, a lot of the TA tech and HR tech space is with entrepreneurs who are now American, but were not always American, who the CEO of Smart Recruiters, the founder of Phenom, a lot of companies, basically. I'm sure more than half of the CEOs come from abroad, but they end up building American companies. And what I mean by that is companies that have the regulatory framework of the US in mind, specifically on the candidate side. A lot of this is around equal employment opportunity and diversity hiring, which does not work the same way outside of the US. It's very strange for me I just took a survey and I was asked about my diversity metrics, and I'm like, I don't know who's the minority in my company. I don't even know. I think I'm the minority. I don't know. It's just a different narrative outside the US.
Yeah, it sure is. I remember I was at Connexo, we were trying to figure out for one of the clients, they had trouble getting all their resumes parsed properly, and we had a good parsing partner. There's nothing wrong there, but all their resumes had pictures on them and their birth date and stuff. I mean, this was the golden rule in that country. That's just how it was done.
For sure.
And then the parser wasn't expecting these kind of things. So it's a global world, and you have to really accommodate. You can't just say one size fits all. Good luck.
I can't keep track anymore. Which countries are we putting the pictures in, and which countries are we not putting the pictures in? It's it's hard to keep track sometimes.
Right? Yeah. No, it's different, but so it's from a consolidation standpoint, it's certainly we're seeing a lot more where even whether it's consolidating or growing, the acquisitions, sometimes it's to buy the market share, right? So you look at iSIMS and some others that have been buying companies abroad. And I think it's smart, actually, compared to investing a lot of money in developing new teams to try to make those relationships required to sell, especially at the enterprise level. And, any enterprise level type TA leaders listening is probably thinking the same thing, like, hey, if our abroad type operations want to make their own decisions about their solution, if it works for them and we still get the global like metrics or whatever we need, why not have a different ATS in every region or something, if that's what it takes to get the right results, and maybe aspire to consolidation. And there's some interesting new groups coming out right now that are continuing to push the envelope about vendor collaboration, and data analytics is a great example of one. We just had a collaboration zone in December on that, and some great innovative solutions presented to the influencers in the industry. And there's some interesting results from the scores and all that, but the feedback that came in was amazing from a co-opetition standpoint. They realized, hey, we've got, whether it be geography or industry or business units, you look at the bigger the company is, the more likely they're going to have different systems running in-house. How do you get that data cross-section you need to actually improve results, especially in talent acquisition?
Yeah.
You need a third party, perhaps even just to help figure out what's there, what do we need to measure, what can you measure, what it has to be anonymous. It's so many rules. But if you don't measure it, you can't improve it, and somebody's got to be paying attention to that.
Yeah. I really like the analytics as perhaps the central function that needs to work with every country, every geography, and bring it all together. You, of course, also need to have a central employer branding function, though you would also want to have a local element to that. And of course, you would want IT to have a central policy around data privacy and personal data for the company. But beyond that, I think a decentralized model probably works best in talent acquisition. That's my opinion, and I will keep sharing it with everybody who's willing to listen.
Yeah, it's hard to get it right everywhere. So stick with the best things you have and try to make them work together. And, if you're listening and going, boy, our vendors just don't talk together, they don't work together, they point fingers at each other. I mean, that's the problems that we try to solve, both on the platform level for alliances and partnerships, but also on the advisory side, because if you want to keep your customers, you got to know what their situation is. And the situation is they've got other systems in-house. Doesn't matter whether you're Workday, Oracle, any of the big shops. It's even more so then, because there's a lot of holes. They know it. And even if they don't have the holes that they think they have, or don't, they do, they have more than they think they have. And their partner networks need to be strong and plug and play. And if they can't deliver that, then companies are going to start either, like you said, hiring their own integration experts in-house, which would be sad to see. But if that's the only way you can solve it, then so be it.
And to ask for help or advice on these tricky topics, which no recruiter got into recruitment to do system integration and talk about alliances. Like, it just happened. So a lot of them are probably asking for help. How do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I guess probably the best start would be on LinkedIn, and
Great.
not the only Ward Christman, I don't think, on LinkedIn, but pretty easy to find. And yeah, it's, again, our job is to help the vendors better collaborate so the common customer gets a better result.
Mhm.
So if you have vendors that aren't collaborating well and you want some help there, let us know and make an introduction. We'll see what we can do.
I have a list.
Yeah.
I'll send it to you after we're offline. And before we part ways, I wanted to ask you one of my favorite questions is for you to not think about your current job, but think as a practitioner of somebody who's hired people, a manager, and go back to the days when you made a terrible hiring mistake. Oh, I don't want names. I don't want specifics. I just want to know, what was the terrible hiring mistake that you made and what can we learn from it?
Wow. Okay.
You got a few names. I see your eyes are glazing.
Yeah. So, everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses, right? But, I guess one of my bigger mistakes was just believing that somebody had the technical skills that they said they did, and just didn't. They totally fabricated it, and it took a while to uncover that. So, that delayed. This was years ago, but
Still remember it.
Yeah. It's kind of like, I mean, that's always the challenge. How do you know until they get in front of you? But thankfully these days, there's so many wonderful tools that can either help assess, if not their technical prowess, at least from capability standpoint. What do they actually know? And there's almost too much information out there now, right? So having some good tech partners that can help kind of cut through the...
There are some engineers out there who are way better on paper than in person or in fact, in reality. So a good reminder from Ward to don't skip the technical assessment. It's absolutely time well spent, even if it's, going to avoid you one mistake out of 20. That's still a good investment, and that's still a good investment. So add that to your workflow for every position where it's applicable. Great. Yep. Thanks, Ward. This is great to have you. And well, I'll send you that list of all my naughty partners very shortly.
Yeah, sounds good. I enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Max.
Ciao. That was Ward Christman from HR Tech Advisor and HR Tech Alliances. You can connect with him on LinkedIn if you have one of those tech stack headaches that you're trying to solve. And of course, as you've heard from Ward, there are many companies that are dealing with dozens of different vendors. He was quoting one that had more than 30 existing software providers on talent acquisition. And so I like to think of it as a trend which will continue to evolve and to enable our audience with more ideas and encourage them to try new tools. But when you do so, to always favor those providers that have open API, good documentation. Otherwise, you might be accumulating what could be called interoperability debt. That's the word I'm looking for. And just like you can have technical debt, you could have interoperability debt, which is the concept that if you work with vendors who don't play well with other vendors, it will end up costing you a lot of money. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, please follow us on your podcast player of preference and share with your friends. Thank you.